Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Medal of Honor Heroes for PlayStation Portable. This is a first-person shooter developed by Team Fusion and published by EA in October of 2006 exclusively for the PlayStation Portable. And some of you may be wondering why it's taken me so long to get around to this one, considering that I've already reviewed all of the other games in the Medal of Honor series, except for of course the newest VR exclusive title, as well as Medal of Honor Infiltrator. Well, the simple fact of the matter is, at the time I was reviewing all of the other Medal of Honor games, I didn't have a PSP. As such, while I could review the Wii version of the sequel to this, I couldn't review this particular game, at least not until now, because now I have a PSP and a copy of Medal of Honor Heroes. That said, there are a couple of caveats before I go any further into this video. You see, while this game was actually pretty well received when it came out, at least for a PSP first-person shooter, which is something I'll get to more in a moment, most of the praise directed at the game was actually directed at its multiplayer mode, which featured up to 32 players on a server. Which doesn't sound like much for PC or console standards, but for a PlayStation Portable, just a handheld gaming system in general, that's actually a pretty big deal. But while that was certainly impressive, it does bring up the issue of if you're depending on your multiplayer mode, then that requires you to have a player base, and it also requires you to have the online infrastructure up and running. With the online servers for this game having been shut down over a decade ago at this point, you can't play this game online anymore, which means the only facsimile I'm going to be able to cover regarding the multiplayer here is the offline skirmish mode against the AI. And that has its own issues, which I'll talk about when I get to that point. So obviously, I can't review this game exactly as it was in 2006. What I can do, however, is cover all of the single-player content and how the game generally plays, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing throughout the rest of this review. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is basically like a scaled-down and much less good-looking Medal of Honor European Assault. And I mean that in the sense that basically all of the assets that were used in this game were just ripped from European Assault. In the visual department, they just ripped models, textures, animations, pretty much everything from Medal of Honor European Assault, which to some degree is fine. I mean, European Assault was a decent enough looking game when it came out, given the systems that it came out on. But when you have that weird experience of having that all scaled down to work properly on a PSP without the PSP combusting, and then ultimately scaling that back up to 1080p, which even European Assault wasn't designed to run at, it ends up looking pretty rough. Thing is, it's easy to excuse that because you gotta keep in mind this was meant to be played on a PSP with a very small screen, even though the PSP is capable of outputting its video and audio signal to a TV. And I can say that when you're playing this on the actual PSP, it looks fine. Now, what you're seeing in this video was not recorded directly from a PSP, because the process for recording from PSP is a bit of a pain in the ass. I have to convert the signal either to RCA, which then goes into another converter, which then goes into my recording box, and then I can record it, or I use an HDMI cable, and I can't remember where I put my HDMI cable that also has to hook up to USB to power the converter. That whole process is a mess, and it ends up resulting in video recording quality that's actually pretty bad. So what I found was the best process for me to record gameplay footage reliably was to just back up my physical copy of the game and then play that back up in an emulator and record that. So that's what you've been seeing throughout this video, and while it does apply some light filtering, it really doesn't make all that much of a difference. It does have some oddities with the performance. The game on PSP runs fine, but I did notice some weird things here and there with the emulator where it'll slow down some animations for no discernible reason, and then it'll speed them back up later. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it's just a mild annoyance that doesn't really affect the gameplay. And since the game runs absolutely fine on the actual hardware, I'm not going to hold that against it. Anyway, all of that said, the game doesn't look especially good, but what about the sound design? Well, that's where you also run into some issues with asset reuse. The music is reused from previous Medal of Honor games, the sound effects are mostly reused from Medal of Honor European Assault, although obviously with lower audio quality given that it's a PSP and they had to compress things a lot more. And then there's the voice acting, where the narration is fine, but nothing particularly impressive, And the battle chatter is also mostly fine, but also ripped from other Medal of Honor games, and it tends to repeat so much that it will gradually drive you insane.
Nice shot! Keep at it! Got him on the run! Keep at it! Nice shot! Keep at it! We've got him on the run! Keep at it!
Yeah, needless to say, that got very annoying very quickly. So when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that, compared to the rest of the Medal of Honor series, is basically just an asset flip. But when you look at the visuals as a PSP game, it's actually a bit impressive, and the sound is, well, just very repetitive for the most part. But you know what? At least when they picked a game to rip the sound effects from, they picked European Assault, which at that point had the best sound effects in the entire Medal of Honor series. Actually, now that I think about it, it probably still has the best sound effects in the entire Medal of Honor series, but that's beside the point. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay. Or rather, what passes for a story in this, because this doesn't really have a story per se. It has setup, but it doesn't have any real plot that the game actually follows. You have 3 sort of mini campaigns, where in each one you take control of a different character from the Medal of Honor franchise, and you go on a series of missions in a certain theater of war. In the first campaign, you take on the role of Sergeant John Baker, the same character you played as in Medal of Honor Allied Assault's Breakthrough expansion, which was the worst expansion for that game, by the way. And you just go on a series of missions during the battles in Italy. In the second campaign, you take on the role of Lieutenant Jimmy Patterson, who was the protagonist of the original Medal of Honor as well as Medal of Honor Frontline. And that campaign takes place during Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Then the final campaign is set during the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, and you take on the role of Lieutenant William Holt, the protagonist of Medal of Honor European Assault. And like with the other 2 campaigns, it's just a bunch of not really connected missions that just happen to take place during the Battle of the Bulge. Each campaign starts with some narration that's accompanied by some newsreel footage, and it basically just gives you an idea of who you're going to be playing as and what you're ultimately going to be doing. But once you actually go into the campaign itself and you start going into the missions, all of the briefings are just done entirely in text, and the missions themselves are all just self-contained. You just go in, you complete your objectives, and then you move on to the next thing. There's not really any actual story there. The missions will be broken up into the main objectives, which once you complete all of those, then the mission will end, and the secondary objectives, which are basically just there to give you some bonus things to do, and that usually just involves going and finding some piece of intel or maybe eliminating a specific enemy. But the main objectives don't really have much variety to them either. They are very basic things, like just going and capturing territory and then moving on to the next flag to capture, or going and then capturing points and then just holding them while a score timer ticks down, or you just go into an area and you eliminate a certain number of enemies. The only time they really shake things up are when they have you infiltrate an area, complete a bunch of objectives, which usually just involves finding some piece of intel or planting a demolition charge on something, and then getting out of the area by just going back to where you spawned. But that's not really variety. This game very quickly becomes extremely repetitive, which is impressive, because it's less than 2 hours long. When I reviewed the footage, which covered every single mission in the game, and I completed all of the side objectives in all of these missions, it took me about an hour and 40 minutes to finish the whole thing on the veteran difficulty setting, which is basically this game's equivalent of medium. And while I'll be fair and say that I really wasn't expecting some super lengthy, expansive campaign out of a PSP first-person shooter, it's still really weird to see a Medal of Honor game that clocks in at less than 2 hours. That really screams that they just phoned the whole thing in. Although if you take more than a passing glance at the game, it's pretty painfully obvious they phoned the whole thing in. Not only does the game completely lack variety in objectives and missions, and not only is the campaign so ridiculously short, but of course they have all of the assets that they just copied and pasted from Medal of Honor European Assault down to the weapons behaving in basically the exact same way. They have the AI being dumber than a sack of hammers to the point where they can stand right in front of you and just miss every shot, or they can be a mile away and sometimes hit you, but it doesn't really matter because you can tank all of the damage and you get med kits that you can replenish your health with. And of course there's also the joy of watching your teammates just shoot at nothing or shoot at walls or get stuck on things or just spaz out in general. And this also extends over into the skirmish mode, by the way. The AI in that is ridiculously stupid and poses no real challenge to you whatsoever, and you can't even adjust the difficulty of the AI in that, so that doesn't help. And it also doesn't help that several of the levels are actually copied and pasted, and not only are they copied and pasted, they make no alterations to them whatsoever other than maybe adjusting the lighting. And of course, as you might expect, the multiplayer levels, and of course the skirmish levels by extension, are just copy and pasted from the single-player campaign, and that brings the gameplay design into very sharp focus, because it becomes painfully obvious at that point that they basically just made the campaign as a sort of primer to get you used to the maps and to get you used to the general gameplay mechanics so you would be able to play the multiplayer. And of course, now that the multiplayer is completely unplayable, that's an entirely moot point. But even if you were able to put all of that aside, even if you were ignoring all of the single-player stuff, and you were focusing entirely on the multiplayer, that would not save the game from its fundamental flaw, the one that completely ruins the entire experience. And you should have seen this coming from a mile away when I said that this game is a PlayStation Portable exclusive. It's the controls, which no matter what the apologists will say, no matter what fans of this game will tell you, no matter what you saw from reviews that came out around the time this released that completely excused the issues that the controls bring, these controls are atrocious. Remember, this is a 3D first-person shooter where you have to aim up and down. You can't just aim left and right. If that were the case, then the controls available on the PSP would have been fine. They would have been a bit clunky, but you would have been able to put up with it. But since this is a first-person shooter that requires you to aim up and down, you need a way to look up and down. So how exactly do you accomplish this when you have a device with the analog stick and the D-pad on the left side of the device, and on the right side of the device, you just have the face buttons? Well, if you're left-handed, then it may not be that much of an issue, because you can set the analog stick as your look control, and then you can just set the face buttons to moving forward, backward, left, and right, and you can sort of muddle through it. Even then, that's assuming that you normally play console first-person shooters with your left hand being the look control and your right hand being the movement control. But if you use the more standard way of playing first-person shooters on console, where your left hand controls the movement and your right hand controls not only the action buttons but also the look controls, then trying to use the analog stick to aim is going to be a horrendously awkward proposition. So, what's your option in that case? Well, you set the analog stick to the movement controls, and you use the face buttons to look up, down, left, and right. Which means that the D-pad turns into your action buttons. As you can probably tell from the gameplay footage, that is the control scheme I ended up using, where the face buttons ended up being the look controls. And as I'm sure you can tell, not only was it very sluggish and clunky, but it was so horrendously awkward that it made the game barely playable. And that just highlights how important it is to take hardware limitations into consideration when you are designing a game. A game like Doom will work perfectly fine on a system that doesn't have a second analog stick because you don't need to look up and down. You can rely on the aim assist. A game like GoldenEye 64 is definitely clunky, but it is playable with only one analog stick because the aim assist is so strong. It just automatically aims at things for you, so you don't need to worry about it. This game, on the other hand, really doesn't have much in the way of aim assist, and so you end up having to aim manually at pretty much everything, and that just ends up being horrendously clunky. All it really does is serve to illustrate just how terrible of an idea making a 3D first-person shooter on the PSP was. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's interesting that they tried anyway, and it's interesting that they were able to port so much of the general gameplay style of the Medal of Honor series to a handheld platform like this, but the end result is just so thoroughly miserable to play that it ends up being a prime example of the old adage of just because you can doesn't mean you should. And while I was honestly very tempted to give this a 0.5 out of 5 just because of how miserable it is to play, it is at least functional as software. It is stable, it runs pretty decently, and it is technically playable from start to finish, so it really ends up falling more into 1 out of 5 territory. It is still an absolutely terrible game that I cannot recommend on any level, but it is at least interesting as a historical curiosity, as a game that was made for a platform that frankly it had no business being on, but they tried to make it work anyway and just failed spectacularly. And at least, if absolutely nothing else, it serves as a warning to all developers out there. Make sure you keep the hardware limitations of the platform you're developing for in mind when you decide what type of gameplay you're going for. Because if the hardware doesn't support the gameplay style you're going for, then you either need to completely rethink the gameplay style, or rethink the choice of platform. Thank you all very much for watching. And if you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or getting new equipment, or replacing broken equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.